Hey everyone, and welcome back to our quiet little corner of the past. If you're still with me, go ahead and take a deep breath. Let the tension in your shoulders just melt away as we descend further into the flickering, orange-hued shadows of late 19th century Istanbul. I know we've touched on the broad strokes of the 1883 fire, but to truly understand the sheer, agonizing slowness of this disaster, we need to spend some time in the smoke with the people who were actually there. This wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a tragedy of minutes and hours. Hours spent waiting for permissions that never came. So let's widen the lens and look at the Harem Fire in its full, stifling detail. To really get the why behind the what, we have to look closer at Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He's often called the Red Sultan or Abdul the Damned, but in our world tonight, he's just a man with a very intense anxiety disorder. He didn't live in the Eski Saray or the Old Palace where the fire occurred. No, he lived in the Yildiz Palace, which was basically a high-security campus built on a hill. He was obsessed with clocks and locks. He even had a workshop where he made his own furniture, specifically cabinets with hidden compartments for revolvers. He was a man who understood that in his world, a door wasn't just wood, it was a statement. And this obsession with security was the atmosphere that leaked into every other palace in the city, including the Old Palace. The Eski Saray sat on the site of the ancient Byzantine Acropolis. It was a massive complex, a city within a city. But by 1883, it was a place of ghosts. When a sultan died, his entire harem, his wives, his concubines, their servants, were moved out of the main Topkapi Palace and relocated to the Old Palace. It was a tradition meant to clear the stage for the new sultan's household. Because why have one messy family when you can have a succession of them living in different buildings? Inside these walls lived hundreds of women who had once been the most powerful figures in the empire. They were the Valide Sultans, queen mothers of the past, the favorites of rulers long dead. They lived in a world of extreme luxury, but zero mobility. They had silver coffee sets, fine French perfumes, and silk dresses that cost more than a village, but they couldn't walk to the corner store for a piece of fruit. The social structure inside was incredibly rigid. You had the Kalfas, or senior managers, who ran the day-to-day operations with the iron fist of a boarding school headmistress. Below them were the young girls, mostly from the Caucasus, who were being trained in the arts of etiquette, music, and, ironically, how to be invisible. On the night of the fire, the air in the old palace was likely thick with the smell of coal braziers and expensive incense. It was a winter evening, and the women were huddled in their private apartments. In these palaces, they used things called tandirs, basically a table with a heater underneath covered by a heavy quilt. You'd sit around it, tuck your legs under the blanket, and stay warm while the drafty halls stayed freezing. Now, imagine a spark from one of those heaters landing on a stray bit of silk or a dusty carpet. Because the palace was a labyrinth of wooden partitions, it didn't take much. But because the palace was also a labyrinth of secrets, no one wanted to be the first to scream. To scream was to cause a disturbance, and in the harem, a disturbance was a breach of etiquette. When the smoke first started to drift into the grand corridors, the first reaction wasn't to run, it was to consult. The lower-ranking servants went to the Kalfas went to the chief black eunuch. The chief black eunuch, a man of immense power and equally immense concern for his head, had to decide if this was a real fire or just a small kitchen mishap that he could handle without bothering the sultan. And this is where the disaster truly begins to brew. In Abdul Hamid's world, reporting a fire at a royal palace was practically a political act. Was it an arson attempt by the Young Turks? Was it a signal to the Russian fleet? While the officials were weighing the political implications of the smoke, the fire was quietly eating through the cedar beams of the laundry wing. let's float over to the gates of the palace. Outside, the Tulambachi, the volunteer firemen, had already noticed the glow in the sky. These men were legendary in Istanbul. They were basically the neighborhood tough guys who carried their fire pumps on their shoulders like litters. They were loud, they were colorful, and they were ready to work. But as they arrived at the massive iron-studded gates of the Eski Saray, they were met not with gratitude, but with spears. The police guards, the Bostanchis, stood their ground. They had one standing order: no male, under any circumstances, enters the harem. The firemen shouted that the roof was already caving in. The guards replied that the Sultan hadn't authorized an entry. It was a standoff between the physical reality of fire and the social reality of the Ottoman court. And for a long, agonizing hour, the social reality won.
Inside the palace, the situation was moving from concerning to apocalyptic. We have to remember that these women were essentially trained for stillness. They were the protected, the veiled. The idea of running out into the street was, for many of them, as terrifying as the fire itself. The smoke was no longer a drift, it was a wall. It moved through the narrow hallways, choking the light out of the oil lamps. Can you imagine the sound? Not the roar of flames yet, but the crackling of old wood, the distant shouting from outside the walls, and the frantic, whispered prayers of 100 women who were waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to leave. The chief black eunuch, seeing that the laundry wing was gone and the main dormitory was next, finally sent a frantic telegram to Yildiz Palace. But the Sultan's staff was notorious for filtering information. They didn't want to wake the Sultan with bad news unless they had a solution. So they spent another 30 minutes debating. If we let the firemen in, can we put veils on all the women first? Should we move them to the garden, or is the garden too visible from the neighboring houses? It's this specific kind of royal pedantry that makes your skin crawl. They were treating a life or death situation like a seating chart at a difficult dinner party. Meanwhile, back at the old palace, the heat was becoming unbearable. The Iznik tiles on the walls were beginning to pop and crack from the temperature. This is where we see the tragic reality of the 100. These weren't just the Sultan's wives, they were the invisible staff of the harem. The young girls, the elderly former concubines who had no family to go back to, the servants who were the last to be told anything. Some accounts suggest that as the fire spread, the eunuchs actually locked the doors to certain wings, not to be cruel, but to contain the women and prevent them from wandering into the areas where the male firemen might eventually be admitted. It was a containment strategy for modesty, not for safety. By the time the Sultan actually received the message and realized the old palace was truly lost, the fire had reached the main living quarters. Abdul Hamid II's response was a masterpiece of paranoia. He reportedly ordered that a curtain of silence be maintained. He didn't want a public spectacle. He finally gave the order for the gates to be opened, but with a condition. The firemen could only enter the outer courtyards. They were to pass the water buckets to the eunuchs, who would then take them into the harem. Imagine the efficiency of that. You have a roaring inferno and you're trying to fight it with a bucket brigade of men who have never fought a fire in their lives, while the professional firemen are forced to stand outside in the dirt, literally handing over the tools of their trade to amateurs. As the women realized that no official rescue was coming, the panic finally broke the decorum. This is when the scarves began to appear at the windows. Silk, gold-threaded, expensive fabrics being used as distress signals. The crowds outside, the thousands of Istanbul residents who had gathered to watch, could see the silhouettes of the women against the orange glow of the interior. Some of the younger women, driven by the sheer instinct to breathe, began to climb onto the roof. But the roofs were steep and made of lead and tile. In the winter chill, they were slick. There are accounts of women slipping into the courtyard, or worse, being forced back down by guards who were worried about them being seen from the street. The 100 weren't just victims of the fire, they were victims of a system that didn't know how to handle an emergency that involved its private property. In the hierarchy of the palace, the building was a relic, the women were a memory, and the sultan's reputation was the only thing that actually mattered.
By midnight, the fire had done its work. The central dome of the Eski Sarai had collapsed in a shower of sparks that could be seen all the way across the Golden Horn. The Eski in the name, meaning old, had become a literal description. The palace was a skeleton. The rescue, if you can even call it that, was a chaotic mess of silk and smoke. The cloth corridor the Sultan had ordered, that long canvas tunnel to hide the women as they were moved, was finally erected, but it was too little, too late. The women who had survived were bundled into closed carriages, wrapped in heavy furs and veils so that not a single inch of skin was visible to the crowds. They were taken to the Topkapi Palace, which was also mostly empty and drafty, or scattered to smaller villas along the Bosphorus. For many of them, the fire was the only time they had seen the outside of the palace walls in 40 years, and even then, they only saw it through the smoke and the thick curtains of a carriage. In the days that followed, the official palace news, the Takvim-i-Wakai, barely mentioned the fire. They reported a small incident that had been quickly contained by the Sultan's wisdom. They didn't mention the deaths. They didn't mention the 100 women who had vanished from the rolls. But the city knew. The Tulumbachi firemen told their stories in the coffee houses. The foreign ambassadors wrote long, scathing dispatches back to London and Paris about the inefficiency and cruelty of the Ottoman system. It became a piece of propaganda for everyone who wanted to see the empire fall. Abdulhamid II, for his part, went into an even deeper state of isolation. He saw the fire as a personal failure, not because people died, but because his secrecy had been breached. He became obsessed with the idea that the fire had been a distraction for a theft. He spent weeks demanding an inventory of the palace's treasures. Where is the emerald-encrusted clock? What happened to the mother-of-pearl chess? To him, the loss of the physical objects was a quantifiable disaster. The loss of the women was just a change in the payroll. As for the women who survived, their lives didn't get better. They were moved from a burning cage to a cold one. The trauma of the fire followed them. Many of the survivors reportedly suffered from what we would now call PTSD, waking up in the middle of the night screaming about the smell of cedar smoke. The site of the old palace eventually became the home of the Ministry of War and later Istanbul University. If you walk there today, you're walking over the ashes of the harem. The grand gates are gone, replaced by modern academic buildings. But the story of the Harem Fire remains a haunting reminder of what happens when a government cares more about the image of power than the lives of the people it's supposed to protect. It's a long, slow, tragic story, a fire that didn't need to happen, a rescue that wasn't allowed to work, and 100 names that were simply erased from history because they were forbidden. So, let's let the smoke clear from our minds. The fire is out, the palace is dust, and the Sultan's locks are all broken. You're here in the present, where the air is clear and the night is quiet. Now, if the Habsburgs were about the jaw, the Romanovs of the early 20th century were about the blood. If you're still with me, let's move into the snowy, slightly paranoid atmosphere of late imperial Russia. It's a world of Fabergé eggs, heavy furs, and a very small boy named Alexei, who was, quite literally, as fragile as glass. Alexei was the long-awaited heir to Tsar Nicholas II. After 4 daughters, who were all lovely and healthy, but, according to the laws of the time, not boys, the birth of Alexei in 1904 should have been a triumph. But there was a problem, a very specific Queen Victoria-flavored problem. You see, Queen Victoria was the grandmother of Europe, and she was also a carrier of hemophilia. Because the royals of Europe treated the continent like a giant game of Tinder, blue blood edition, she spread that gene into the royal houses of Germany, Spain, and Russia. When Alexandra, the granddaughter of Victoria, married Nicholas II, she brought that royal malady with her. For Alexei, a simple bruise wasn't just a bruise, it was a potential death sentence. If he bumped his knee or fell while playing, the bleeding wouldn't stop. It would pool in his joints, causing agonizing pain that lasted for weeks. Imagine being the Tsar of all the Russias, a man who commands millions of soldiers, and being completely helpless because your son tripped over a rug. This created a palace atmosphere that was incredibly hushed and anxious. The Empress Alexandra became obsessed with her son's safety. She turned the palace into a high-security nursery. Every corner was padded, every movement was watched, and because the Romanovs were terrified that the public would see the heir's weakness, they kept the illness a total secret. This is where the weird factor enters the story. When science failed, and 1900s science was mostly just doctors looking confused and suggesting rest, Alexandra turned to the supernatural. Enter Rasputin. Now, Rasputin is usually portrayed as this terrifying, leather-clad monk with crazy eyes, and, well, he kind of was. But to the Romanovs, he was just our friend. He was the only person who seemed to be able to stop Alexei's bleeding through what he called prayer, and what modern historians suspect was probably just a very effective form of hypnosis that calmed the boy down and lowered his blood pressure. Imagine the dinner parties. You're a Russian noble trying to have a nice, quiet evening, and there's a Siberian peasant with food in his beard sitting at the Tsar's table, leaning over and whispering secrets to the Empress. It was a PR nightmare, but the Romanovs didn't care about PR. They cared about their glass boy. The tragedy of the Romanovs is that their intense claustrophobic love for their son blinded them to the fact that their country was literally falling apart. While they were worrying about Alexei's latest bruise, the rest of Russia was worrying about, not starving to death. It's that ironic contrast again, a family so focused on the survival of one child that they missed the collapse of an entire civilization. But let's keep it sleepy. Imagine the snow falling outside the Alexander Palace. The bells of the Kremlin are ringing in the distance. Inside, the rooms are filled with the scent of incense and expensive perfume. Alexei is resting on a sofa, and Rasputin is sitting in the corner, humming a low, repetitive tune. It's a very still, very heavy kind of silence, the silence of an era that's about to end but hasn't quite realized it yet.